So in the past few days, an unprecedented immigration enforcement action in the US has sent shockwaves across the Korean business community and the Korean society in general. So US authorities stormed a major construction site in Georgia, specifically the future battery plant jointly built by Hyundai Motor Group and LG Energy Solution, and they detained nearly 500 workers. Now, what made headlines was that more than 300 of them were Korean. So on September 4th, federal agents from U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, aka ICE, and Homeland Security Investigations, aka HSI, executed a court-approved raid on the HLGA battery plant site in Alabama, Georgia. And they arrested 475 workers, citing violations ranging from overstaying visas to working without employment authorization. U.S. officials later confirmed that a significant majority were South Korean citizens, with others from Latin America and Indonesia. And this marks the largest single-site immigration enforcement action in U.S. history. And while the official investigation is still ongoing, the fallout is immediate because Korean corporations are scrambling. The South Korean government is mobilizing diplomatic channels, and the case has already become a political flashpoint in both countries. So at first glance, the news seems almost absurd. Like, how could employees of major corporations like Hyundai and LG, the companies with decades of international experience, end up with hundreds of workers being detained for visa violations? Like, shouldn't a company of this scale know how to navigate U.S. labor laws? Now, the answer lies in the complexity of the U.S. visa system and in practices that have quietly existed for years in global construction projects. Most of the Koreans detained were reportedly in the U.S. on B1 business visas or under the ESTA visa waiver program. And both categories allow short-term visits for meetings, training, or negotiations, but they strictly forbid paid manual labor. And two U.S. authorities working on a construction site falls squarely into that forbidden labor category. So why didn't these workers enter on proper employment visas then? The issue isn't quite new. Back in 2020, at another Korean battery plant construction site, back then it was SK Battery America in Georgia. Then HSI detained 13 Korean workers for the very same reason. And they had entered the US on ESTA, but ended up working on site. And in that case, the violation only came to light after some workers caught COVID, and their treatment was processed through insurance, which exposed their employment status. And from the corporate perspective, the situation is quite frustrating because the US work visa system is both expensive and slow. The H/1B visa, often cited in media coverage, isn't really designed for construction workers. It's for specialized professionals like engineers, IT workers, and researchers, and it is capped at $85,000 per year through a lottery system. And in 2025, nearly 500,000 people applied, which made chances slim. And it's also unrelated to manual labor or temporary project needs. The more realistic option for Korean companies would have been the E2 investor visa, which is available because South Korea is a U.S. treaty partner. Now, this visa can cover essential employees, quote-unquote essential employees, working at a foreign investment project. But applying for E2 visas takes months and requires extensive paperwork and costs thousands of dollars per worker when you factor in fees, translations, notarizations, and legal services. And corporations often prefer to bypass these hurdles by sending workers temporarily on business visas, expecting enforcement to remain, pretty lax. And for years, this gray area practice had gone largely unchecked. But in today's stricter U.S. immigration climate, especially under political pressure, what used to pass quietly has now triggered the largest enforcement action in HSI's history. Now, the raid didn't just end with hundreds of workers in custody. Its ripple effects have quickly escalated into a diplomatic and political storm. So, in terms of corporate response, LG Energy Solution was the first to respond publicly. The company confirmed that 47 of its own employees, including 46 Koreans and one Indonesian, were among those detained, along with about 250 workers from partner firms. So in total, nearly 300 people tied to LGES, LG Energy Solution, were swept up. In an emergency statement, the company announced it was suspending all U.S. business trips for employees except for essential client meetings. Now, staff who are already in the U.S. were told to either return home or remain on standby at their accommodations. LGES also scrambled to set up support systems. They began gathering medical information to ensure detainees had access to necessary prescription medications and promised to work with U.S. authorities to secure their delivery. Kim Gi-soo, who is LG's chief human resources officer, was dispatched to the U.S. to personally lead the crisis response. Hyundai, for his part, distanced itself kind of slightly, stating that none of the detainees were directly employed by Hyundai Motor America. Still, the company emphasized its commitment to complying with U.S. law while continuing their multi-billion-dollar investments in American manufacturing. Now, in South Korea, the reaction was pretty swift and unusually sharp. So the Ministry of Foreign Affairs expressed regret, saying the rights of Korean nationals must not be unfairly infringed. Foreign Minister Cho Hyun convened an emergency meeting and established an Overseas Citizens Protection Task Force. He warned that Korea is gravely concerned and even suggested he might personally travel to Washington, D.C. to negotiate if necessary. President Lee Jae-myung also weighed in, instructing officials to do everything possible to protect detained citizens and resolve the matter quickly. He stressed that the detentions occurred in the context of bilateral investment and cooperation, not in an attempt by Koreans to live illegally in the U.S. Meanwhile, in Georgia, politics took center stage. Tory Branham, who's a Trump-supporting Republican congressional candidate, she publicly claimed credit for tipping off ICE about the Korean firms, ICE. So in interviews, she argued that companies receiving, what did she say? Yeah, so she argued that companies receiving tax breaks should be hiring American workers, not cheap illegal immigrants. She insisted that local skilled labor was available and accused Korean companies of undercutting U.S. workers. Now, Branham's comments tapped directly into the Trump-aligned MAGA base, where illegal immigration is a rallying cry. But what shocked many Koreans was her casual admission that she hadn't expected so many Koreans to be detained. She assumed most would be on legal H-1B visas. Instead, the reality of 300 Koreans in detention quickly became a flashpoint for nationalist and anti-immigrant rhetoric in U.S. local politics. The crisis also turned into ammunition for Korean politics. Opposition figures like Na Kyung-won, she accused the President Lee's administration of being incompetent and irresponsible, saying they failed to protect their citizens while pouring out investments abroad. She questioned whether much publicized diplomatic hotlines with Washington were anything more than just empty slogans. So, in short, what started as a workplace enforcement raid has now escalated into a corporate, diplomatic, and political crisis touching both, Seoul and Washington. Now, this crisis isn't just about one raid in Georgia, after all, right? It reveals deep structural tensions between foreign investments, immigration law, and political narratives in both countries. So, South Korea is one of the largest foreign investors in U.S. manufacturing, particularly in electric vehicle batteries. Companies like Hyundai, LG, and SK are pouring millions and billions, billion level, into American plants to meet EV demand and benefit from US government incentives like the Inflation Reduction Act. And these projects are marketed as job creators. Yet, the Georgia raid underscores a paradox. If a significant portion of the workforce consists of Korean staff flown in under short-term visas, the promised local job benefits may appear hollow to U.S. politicians and communities. And this perception is exactly what Tory Branham tapped into, it seems like, accusing Korean companies of taking tax incentives while relying on foreign or undocumented labor. And regardless of whether her framing is fair, it might resonate in the current U.S. political climate, where immigration is one of the most polarizing issues. Now, for corporations, the challenge is pretty practical. Like large-scale construction projects demand skilled workers who understand proprietary processes, especially in cutting-edge industries like batteries. And training local workers takes time. So flying in Korean employees is often faster and it ensures consistency. But U.S. work visa categories, again, are poorly suited for this purpose. The H-1B, the visa, is too limited and geared toward white-collar professionals. The L-1 works for company executives or specialists, but doesn't scale for hundreds of workers. And the E-2 visa, on the other hand, is more viable, but it is expensive, paperwork heavy, and selective, and it could deter companies for pursuing it en masse. And in that gap between corporate needs and immigration law, companies often gamble by sending workers on business visas, assuming enforcement won't be aggressive. So the Georgia raid signals that such assumptions may no longer hold. Like what used to be a gray area is now being treated as a bright red line, so to say. Now for Korea, the political blow is twofold. Domestically, critics accuse the government of failing to protect its people. Internationally, Korea must manage relations with Washington while protecting workers from being branded as illegal immigrants. And the Korean government has already framed the workers as participants in a legitimate bilateral investment project, not as intentional lawbreakers. And whether that argument resonates in Washington remains to be seen. Now, for the U.S., the operation sets a precedent because by conducting the largest single-site immigration raid in HSI history, authorities are sending a message not only to Korean corporations but to all foreign investors that compliance will be strictly enforced and political optics matter as much as economics. At least that's how I'm understanding. So looking ahead, Korean companies, Korean firms will likely need to rethink their labor strategies. Like relying on short-term visas may be too risky, and companies may have to invest more in securing E-2 visas, training local workers despite higher costs, or building hybrid labor pipelines that could satisfy both business needs and immigration rules. I mean, it will cost more and take longer, but this raid may have permanently raised the stakes. And so, behind these sweeping numbers and political battles, and the people who now, what's becoming the biggest issue is that there are people who now sit in detention centers. Many of them are not nameless illegals, but skilled employees who were sent abroad by their companies, expecting to contribute to a high-profile project. And overnight, they became the center of an international scandal, like handcuffed and branded as lawbreakers. So for their families in Korea, the news must have come as a shock. Like parents, spouses, and children suddenly found their loved ones caught up in a foreign legal system with uncertain timelines and outcomes. And for the workers themselves, the sense of humiliation and helplessness is hard to measure. And this could raise a difficult truth that in the global economy, workers often bear the heaviest consequences of corporate shortcuts and political agendas. And whether or not companies or governments resolve the dispute swiftly, I hope it gets resolved swiftly, the human cost, the human toll is already here. And on those who are detained and treated as expendable. And that's where this story stretches beyond policy or business, I think, because it's about how societies treat the very people who build the infrastructure of progress. So here are some questions for you guys. How should companies or firms ensure their workers aren't left vulnerable in the pursuit of efficiency here? And what responsibility do governments have to protect citizens working abroad under corporate orders? And at a deeper level, should immigration systems adapt to the realities of global projects, or should corporations adapt to the systems as they are? And if there are other issues or questions that weren't raised in this video, let's discuss and feel free to comment. Okay? I will see you guys again in the next video. Peace and love. Bye-bye.